check out this nightmare experience that this American had investing in Mexico real estate. I bought a derelict house on the ocean in Puerto Aventuras and put 10 million pesos into it to restore it to glory. I also bought beach property around Mahahual, 20 hectares on Lake Bacalar, and a 2,000 hectare ranch that had been abandoned near Chetumal. We then went to work. We hired 7 full-time employees to work the ranch in addition to protecting it from poachers. Among the species we protect are deer, tapirs, jaguar, and puma. There's a 500 hectare lake on the ranch as well, where when we arrived, poachers were gill netting with 100-meter nets and destroying the fishery for generations to come. We stopped all of that from happening. Birds have now returned and fish now abound. We have given back to nature and the community. Our workers, who come and go each day, are well paid and fed breakfast and lunch. Our foreman lives full-time in a house we built for him and his lovely family. They all get health insurance, and he gets a truck to drive, free gas, free food, a free cell phone, and free access to the internet. Basically, everything is paid for, and he gets to use his salary as discretionary income. It's a great deal for him, but it also works great for us. It's a true win-win for all of us. And how have I been treated in exchange for all that we have done? Not well. My ranch has been invaded twice, once by 10 men with guns who threatened to kill all the workers if they did not leave immediately. We called the police, and what did they do? Nothing. Nothing at all. It took 1 year and more than 2 million pesos to correct the wrong and get my ranch back from the thugs. I have another property that I am currently fighting to preserve from an invasion and have been doing so for more than 3 years. Sure, I've won battles in court so far, but the would-be invaders are still on my property, and I've spent over 200,000 pesos on lawyers. Will I win? Yes, but I have no desire to keep fighting this battle. Mexico requires me to keep spending money simply to hold on to those things that I've already bought and legally paid for. For me, the straw that finally broke the camel's back came last year when a Mexican bank known as Monex stole more than 20 million pesos from our accounts. We had money in the account 1 month, and the next month, bank employees had stolen every peso. Many newspapers and TV networks reported that 158 accounts and nearly 800 million pesos had been robbed from the accounts of Americans and other foreigners. For many of these people, it was their life savings. Did bank officials from Monex get arrested and prosecuted? No, they did not. Has Monex replaced the stolen money in full to those depositors? No, for the most part they have not. In fact, my brother and I have yet to receive 1 peso of the money stolen from us by the bank. We have filed criminal charges and civil actions, but it might be many years before the Mexican government forces Monex to reimburse our funds. So that was Ken's experience. He's a retired dentist and a successful investor, and that's what he went through when buying real estate and owning real estate over the course of 20 years in Mexico. This video is the reasons why I would not buy property in Mexico, and that's the first reason. Many people have horror stories like that when it comes to owning real estate in Mexico. The next reason is that I don't have the same rights as a Mexican citizen when it comes to purchasing real estate. It's even in the Mexican Constitution that foreigners can't own land within 100 kilometers of a country border or within 50 kilometers of the sea. There was this Foreign Investment Act that was initiated that allows foreigners to own that property, but you can't own it directly in your name. You either have to start a corporation or own it through a land trust. It's not a huge deal to take that extra step and own it through one of those ways, but what is a big deal to me, I think it's a huge red flag that as a foreigner, you don't have the same rights as a Mexican citizen when it comes to owning property. Whereas like in the US, foreigners have the same rights as US citizens when it comes to owning property there. The next reason why I wouldn't buy a home in Mexico is the growing anti-foreigner sentiment. I've noticed this increasing over the past 2.5 years or so, but it has gotten really bad in the last 6 months. Let me give you some examples of the most upvoted comments on a recent Facebook post of mine. Please don't move to our country. You are pretty welcome to come and meet us as tourists, believe me. We are warm and welcome and kind people, but when you become a threat to our economy, that is absolutely not cool. That has 104 replies and 1,700 upvotes. I love this video. Hopefully every gringo will go back to their country after watching this. That has 83 replies and 1,200 upvotes. I see these comments on my social media channels every single day. In fact, there's dozens of these every single day. There are still a lot of Mexicans here who are very welcoming, but the list of people like this is growing bigger and bigger and bigger by the day. And with this growing anti-foreigner sentiment comes a bigger and bigger threat of nationalization or some other kind of adverse action towards foreigners. And in almost every single instance around the world where a government wants to screw over foreigners, they do it on assets that cannot be be moved like a home. And let me be clear, I'm not saying that this is a probability, but it's certainly a possibility. Next is that right now, the Mexican peso is relatively strong compared to most other currencies around the world. What this means is that when you take your dollars to convert them into pesos, you're going to get fewer pesos, meaning that it will take more dollars to buy the same house compared to when the Mexican peso was weaker. For example, if you bought a home in Mexico for 2 million pesos at the peak exchange rate in 2020, you paid $80,000. But if you bought another home today for 2 million pesos in Mexico, you're paying $112,000. $80,000 to $112,000 just because of a difference in exchange rate. And most Latin American countries almost make it a national sport to destroy their currency. So if you're interested in using your dollars to buy a home in a Latin American country, you're probably going to be better off if you're patient and you wait for the right opportunity when the exchange rate is more in your favor. The next reason why I wouldn't buy a home in Mexico is there are a lot of laws here that favor both squatters and renters and are kind of disadvantageous towards the owner of the property. In my personal talks with landlords, people who own a lot of homes around Mexico who rent them out, they have a really hard time finding quality tenants. Like, it is super common for them to rent out their house and have the tenant completely destroy it, or they rent out their house and then the tenant is late all the time or doesn't pay rent at all. That's super common. So landlords, or at least the experienced landlords, are very careful about who they rent to. And if you're a quality tenant, if you can prove that you take care of their property and you pay your rent on time every single month, well, then the landlord in all likelihood is going to be really generous with you and isn't going to raise your rent. Just to share a couple examples of laws that favor tenants, if a tenant is renting a house and stops paying rent, it may be a year before the landlord can legally kick that person out of the house. And another example when it comes to laws favoring the tenant is that in certain states, landlords aren't allowed to raise their rent over a certain amount. For example, like let's say you just want to raise your rent to keep up with inflation. Depending on what state you're in, you might not be able to do that. The next reason is the very high closing costs. You'll end up paying between 7 and 10%. That means the day you purchase your home, you've already taken about a 10% loss on your home. The next reason why I'd think twice about buying a home in Mexico is the very high capital gains tax here. There is a way to avoid it, but you have to meticulously follow the law and make sure you're dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's and doing everything perfectly. There's another YouTuber here in Mexico that is very good about knowing all the laws, and he, despite all of his knowledge and his meticulous nature, almost didn't qualify for the capital gains exemption.
We received a bill in an email that said that we owed $30,000 in taxes as a part of this transaction. So Linda immediately calls the lawyer and says, hey, what is this tax bill? What's going on here? And he says, you know what? Although you have all of these bills in your name and bank accounts in your name, things like that, nothing is linked to your Mexican tax number known as an RFC.
Now, thankfully, he was able to qualify for it only because the buyer of the property agreed to delay the sale so he could get that tax ID number on his next bill. But stupid reasons like that could disqualify you from the capital gains exemption, which could cost you tens of thousands of dollars. The next reason is that 99 times out of 100 in Mexico, foreigners don't have access to Mexican credit to purchase a home using funds from a Mexican bank. And also, US banks won't lend against Mexican real estate. So in like 99 out of 100 cases, almost every single time you see someone buying a home in Mexico, they're paying for it in cash. The next reason is that it almost always makes more financial sense to rent in Mexico instead of purchase. Let me show you an example using the last house I was renting. Now, all these numbers are in pesos, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just gonna do this in dollars. So $1,750 to rent, or I could purchase it for $500,000, but that does not include closing costs. So after closing costs, let's call that $535,000. Now, not a lot of people have an extra $535,000 laying around, but let's say you do. It's not like your costs to own the home and there, you're going to have costs every single year, and they're not insignificant. For example, on this particular home, the HOA fee, or what they call mantenimiento, is $3,000 a year. The insurance is probably going to run you about $2,000 a year, but this number could easily be higher if you're in a place like Mexico City that's prone to earthquakes, or if you're in a place that gets hurricanes. And then upkeep on the house, you're probably looking at least $3,000 a year, because this is a pretty large house. It's over 4,000 square feet, and there's a lot of stuff that goes wrong, a lot of stuff that needs constant maintenance. And if you don't do constant maintenance on a house, after 10 years, it's gonna look like hell and be functioning very poorly. So I think that's a very conservative estimate there. And then your property tax is gonna be another $500 a year or so. So in total, we're looking at an extra $8,500 per year when you own the home outright. But if you're renting, you're not subject to paying any of these expenses right here. By the way, don't take anything I'm talking about in this video as financial advice. I'm just showing you how I think. Now let's take a look at this example of what happens if we rent the first year instead of using that $535,000 to buy the home. So if we rent, we will have to pay a significant amount of money, $21,000. Now that does seem like a lot of money, right? But if we take that $535,000 and invest it into something like Ares Capital, which is the biggest and best run business development company, and they're paying over a 10% dividend. So if you put all of your money into there, you're looking at like $55,000 a year in dividend. The thing about business development companies is that their stock prices are very, very volatile. So you have to be buying this for the dividend and not for the stock appreciation. The next option I have to invest in is a VYMI. This is a Vanguard index fund, and its dividend yield is 4.39%. This is a collection of over 1,000 of the best run dividend paying companies in the world. So this is super diverse and a great inflation hedge, and it's still a good dividend payer and far less risk than buying a single stock. So you can buy this, be getting 4.39% dividend yield, plus you're going to get capital appreciation there as well. And there, the first year, you're going to be pulling in about $23,500 in dividends. Despite this being the lowest yield on the list, it's still more than enough to cover your first 12 months of rent. Now stick with me for a couple more minutes, because it is going to blow your mind how much better off you are after 10 years of renting versus having purchased a home. What I consider the most risky option on this list is buying a 1-year CD with a Mexican bank. They're going to be paying you over 11%, netting you about $61,000 in that year. Keep in mind, that's going to be in pesos, not in dollars, that you're going to receive that. And the next option is the 1-year US Treasury, currently paying you over 5%, which is going to bring you in about $27,000. And now let's take a look at what happens to our $535,000 when we invest it over 10 years. $535,000, we're going to put it all into VYMI, because I think this is the safest option of the 4 options I gave. And you might be like, Jordan, you seriously think it's safer than a US Treasury? Yes, absolutely, because a US Treasury guarantees that you lose against inflation, although the default risk is very, very low. It's a guaranteed loss against inflation, whereas this is one of the best inflation hedges you can have. And I'm going to assume a very conservative 7% annual growth rate in this. What we're going to do is we're going to pay our rent using the dividends we collect from this, and then we're going to reinvest what's left over after paying rent. And in addition to that, we're also going to invest $8,500 per year, because remember, that's the amount we would have to put into our home in the form of taxes, insurance, upkeep, things like that. So after the compounding on year 10, you have a portfolio worth $1,256,000 that's paying you annual dividends of over $53,000. Now let's take a look at what your rent will likely look like for the next 10 years. So your first year, you're paying that $21,000, but really it's not $21,000, because you do have to pay a 1-month deposit, and also you'll probably have to pay for this thing they call a póliza jurídica. Basically, it's insurance for the landlord in case you don't pay your rent. And you're going to be a good tenant who pays your rent on time every single month, and you're going to take care of their property. This is very important important for this example, because if you're not a good tenant, you're not going to get this deal and you're going to get your rent raised. But if you are a good tenant, you can likely go to the landlord and be like, hey, I would like to extend this lease for another few years. I really like living here, but I'd like to keep it at the same price. And since you've been a good tenant, they're going to be like, sure, no problem. And if they don't say that, if they say anything else, well then, go find a new home, go find a new landlord, because your next one probably will be okay with this. Of course, this is very much a your mileage may vary kind of thing, but your first 5 years will probably be at the same price of $21,000. But you know, after those 5 years, your landlord is probably going to come to you and be like, hey, my costs are going up, my insurance costs are going up, my monthly HOA fees are going up. I really love having you as a tenant and I'd love for you to stay, but I need to raise your rent 10%. Is that okay? So the next 5 years, you're probably looking at $23,000, even though you do end up paying $222,000 in rent over those 10 years, you end up collecting $360,000 in dividends, and your portfolio grows along with it in one of the safest investments you can own. So if you're a Mexican with access to Mexican credit, or you're one of the very few foreigners who can get a loan from a Mexican bank for a house here, well then that may change your whole equation. But I analyzed 20 homes. I ran these numbers on every single home of 20 homes around Mexico in Querétaro, Mexico City, Monterrey, and Playa del Carmen. And in 19 out of 20 of the homes, the numbers worked out to something similar to what I just showed you. And in just one single case out of 20, the numbers worked out to be pretty even when it came to buying versus renting. So keep that in mind, run the numbers yourself on whatever home you're interested in, and maybe you'll come up with a different result than me. And if you were having your cash and letting that sit in a bank, getting eaten away by inflation, yeah, you're probably going to be better off purchasing the home. But if you're going to invest it in any decent investment, I think in almost all cases, you're going to be better off renting than purchasing, as long as you're not in one of those few rental markets around the country like Puerto Vallarta, for example, where the real estate prices are going nuts. With all of that said, there are very legitimate reasons to buy a home in Mexico. So watch this video on the reasons why I would buy a home in Mexico.